morning, everyone. Thank you for letting me be a little bit late. There was some traffic getting in, and I unfortunately ran into it. So my name is Kaylee Ward. I'm one of the new EASL postdocs, and I'm going to share a little bit of the work I did during my dissertation. This does cover like 8 to 10 years of work, so if you have questions, please ask them, especially because it was community-based. There's lots of things that I'll talk about in a narrative style, and then other things I'll talk about in terms of examples or methods that we used. I do have the town's name that I work with on this little flag here. It's a rule that we have that when we're talking about this particular community, that there is some identification of them while I'm speaking. I also brought a couple books with images and things like that that I'll pass around. I've sort of earmarked the pages because some of them go from left to right and some of them go from right to left. So kind of hard to orient yourself. So as you like, you can pick whatever one you want and pass it around. Just to see some pictures of the community, I think that's important too. But as the title of my talk mentions, we'll be talking about community-based participatory research in a rural setting in particular, and then how we use that research design to remediate both social and environmental problems. And just by like a show of hands, how many of you have heard of CPPR before? About 5, I'll take it. How many of you have used CPPR? 1, I'll take it. So this is good. 2, 3, okay, great. So to start off, let me get this going here. Give you a bit of outline. So I'll talk about myself a little bit for about 5 minutes, and then I'll give a little bit of the disaster context that this project is situated in, because some of you may not be familiar with it. Then I'll go over why we chose CPPR and give you a little bit of a crash course on why we use CPPR. Not like a true workshop, but just to get you familiar with it. I'll go over my community partnerships, as there were many of them, and then some brief examples, and then I'll give you a snapshot of our like 8 to 10 year projects that we did, just so you can see like over time, how did they iteratively change, and then some outcomes and then some discussion. So as I said, my name is Kaylee. This was me and some of my farmers in Minami-Sanriku, which is in Miyagi Prefecture. I have a background in sociology and environmental science and policy, and my training or sort of my applied work is mostly in governance, disasters, working with agriculture, community engagement. I've worked on nonprofit boards, and I'm interested in environmental health and environmental justice. So this project sort of includes all of these pieces, and as you can tell, I kind of dabble a bit. My research areas, or the areas that I'm particularly interested in, are here. So as I mentioned before, environmental justice is pretty integral to what I do, but that can appear in many ways. So I've done projects on water and health equity. I've done work around decision-making with organizational values, which relates to the team science project I work with here at EASL. And then environmental policy and law. So that can be things like water quality. It could be rules about reconstruction. It could be building materials, whatever it is, environmental policy and law. And then of course, my community engagement work. This is sort of the places in which I inhabit. Here we go. And then is there a way to hide the, hide floating meeting controls? Aha, there we go. Okay. So I'm going to talk about myself in many different ways, and that's because I had many different responsibilities in the community, and I also occupied many different positionalities in the community, which I think are important to identify. So I've made the ones that were most important larger on this slide. So those are things like being a friend, a farmer, and of course, an expert, which they utilize me for a lot. But I was also a disaster volunteer starting in about 2014. So I've been in this community for a while. And I was also on local nonprofit boards. There's other identities that really helped me do the work I did, which was that I was a woman, particularly as a white woman, I was viewed as educated. And there's also some nationality benefits of being an American, even though I was a foreigner. So you'll hear me talk about this in the presentation. If the slide will advance. There we go. Okay. So I'm going to give you a crash course on what happened on March 11th, 2011, which is the particular disaster context we are in. So first, I'm going to orient you where we are in Japan. So we're in the northern part of Japan called Tohoku. And then within Tohoku, we're in Miyagi Prefecture. Miyagi Prefecture is shown in red here. And what I've done is I've blown out an image of Minami-Sanriku to the right of that. I won't get into the nitty-gritty, but there's essentially 4 districts in this community. Centrally, we have Shizugawa, To the north, we have Utatsu. To the west, we have Idia, and to the south, we have Togura. These are all very small districts in this community. And the one thing I do want to mention, since we are talking about this disaster, is kind of the bright white or sort of sandy color that you see on this image. So down into here and in the central area, that's where the tsunami inundation was. So that's how far the tsunami came inland. So I can kind of give you a visual representation of what that looks like. In some places, it's up to 5 kilometers inland, so quite far inland. Some of the pictures you're seeing in the books that are being passed around will show you some of the damage from that, but we'll also show you what it looks like after it's been cleaned up and recovered. So what happened on March 11th, 2011? So at 2:46 p.m., Japan is hit by a 9.0 magnitude earthquake, and then within about 30 minutes to 60 minutes later, the eastern part of Japan was hit by a tsunami. So some things that people think about tsunami is that it's just a massive wall of water, and it's just like all one uniform height that hits at the same time, which is not how tsunamis work. So there is a run-up height, and then there's what happens when it moves inland. So the image on your left is essentially the blue dots are the tsunami height at like landfall, that run-up height, and we're at an average of about 20 meters. 10 meters is 30 feet. So that gives you an idea of at landfall how high this was. And then the red circles are what it was inland after it's made landfall. So the section labeled B and C includes most of Iwate and Miyagi Prefecture. And so for Miyagi Prefecture, you can see that we have heights over 20 meters at landfall. So in this particular community, at landfall, it was 10 meters, so an average of 30 feet. But as it moves inland, it goes up to 15 or 20 meters in height, so above 50 feet of water. That's just to give you an idea that this entire building would be mostly underwater. So it's kind of hard to grapple with the amount of ocean that makes landfall. The other thing I do want to make note of is we didn't just have an earthquake and a tsunami on this day, we did have a nuclear catastrophe. So the Fukushima, Daiichi, and Daini plants, they have 6 reactors located there. 3 of them were operating at the time, 3 of them were not. All of them went into emergency shutdown. Great. Unfortunately, where that particular plant was built had known vulnerabilities, and the operator of that plant knew it had known vulnerabilities and still decided to build there. So there's some issues with like corporate and government responsibility here. So the image on your right is an image of radiation or radioactive isotopes of iodine-131 and cesium-134 and cesium-137 as they spread through the air. So the red band here is mostly in Fukushima, and then it spreads out to about 18 different prefectures. This was at the same scale as Chernobyl. It was rated a 7 on the IEA scale. And to give you some context within Japan about this radiation event would be in comparison to when we dropped bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, this event released 168 times more radioactive cesium than the bombs we dropped then. So a lot more radiation activity here. And the reason why I bring this up is because with these coupled, people are grappling with multiple disasters at the same time, but particularly the radiation emergency caused a lot of stigma, especially in the northern region, which impacted the communities I was working with. So what is happening in Minami Sanriku? So these are just some basic statistics about, unfortunately, victims in the community and also loss of households and buildings. So 811 townspeople lost their lives. About 62% of all households were destroyed. If we include things like other built infrastructure, we're looking more at like 84%. So it's pretty much the town no longer exists. Roughly half of the town population becomes immediately homeless and they move into temporary housing shelters. There's about 52 of those temporary housing shelters scattered around this northern region of Japan. And unfortunately, as you might know with rural communities, they tend to be tight-knit. They tend to have a unique culture to them. And instead of moving communities into shelters together, they were sort of separated. So along with dealing with this disaster, you then have the social isolation that comes in when you have this breaking up of the community into temporary housing. Since the disaster, we have had about half the town leave. So rapid depopulation. It's actually accelerated because of the disaster, but gives you an idea of how quickly this disaster affected the community. And I do want to mention harmful political stereotyping because it leads into why we chose CBPR. It's one of the reasons we use that research design. The national government and TEPCO, which was the operator of the particular nuclear power plant, did a lot to try and minimize or invalidate resident concerns about not just radiation contamination, but also things like how are they going to rebuild? Do we need a seawall? Where should people live? These types of things. And some of the rhetoric that was used at the time was that people are not experts, and so therefore they cannot participate in these processes. Similarly, there was other more extreme rhetoric used, and I can recommend a book on this if you're interested in it, where they would say that especially women could not participate in political processes or decision-making processes because they had radiation brain, which was that they were affected by the radiation event and therefore they were essentially not mentally capable. So there was lots of things going on that highly stigmatized not just people of Fukushima, but also people in Miyagi Prefecture because they were just associated with the North. So I've given you some of that. You've also seen some pictures, and I do want to note for those of you who may have heard of this word, I'm not participating in something called disaster pornography, which is very common in journalism where you just show shocking images for the sake of showing shocking images. But I do want to give you an idea of some of what the community looked like as the tsunami was making landfall. So this is from like their 10-year anniversary. They have a website for this. Hopefully it will load. Okay, you don't need to know Japanese. I'll kind of give you play-by-play here. So this is at the port here, and what will happen as I scroll down, it will give us, it'll like zoom in on areas of the community and then show associated images. So if I scroll down, so this is the epicenter, 2:46 p.m. Yes. Oh, is it not share? Okay. How do I just reshare? Yeah. Let's see. Stop share. Let's just stop share.
Share the whole screen.
Okay. Perfect. Okay, can people online now see this? Okay, hide floating meeting photos. Okay, perfect. Thank you for catching that. Okay. So we're down in Togura, that southern district I mentioned to you. And this image was taken after the disaster, which is why you can still see sort of that carving out of the land here. So this is 36 to 54 minutes after the earthquake. And on the right, you'll see images and the little camera icon will move as we move around the community. So within about 36 minutes, we have water here. Within an hour, we had water at the nuclear power plant. So it gives you an idea of how there were differences in terms of landfall timing. So now we're going up into Shizugawa, and we're looking at the hospital here. And now we're looking down towards the bay from Shizugawa. This is the primary river that runs through the community, and it's been dammed up after the disaster. So here we're at 44 to 56 minutes after the earthquake. When people would talk about where they were living, they would just see this like dust cloud coming towards them, and it was all of the debris being kicked up. So this was actually quite dense, and you couldn't really see through it if you were from far away. And there's no one there like taking this picture. This is like a camera on top of this building just to let you know that. So now we're looking out towards the bay, and there's two important buildings. There's one is the hospital, and then one is the primary hotel of this entire community, Hotel Kanyo. They had a ballroom building where they would host like weddings and things like that. And that building is this one here on your left. That building, the hospital, and one other building were the only things remaining in Shizugawa. So now time is passing. You can see the water height is increasing, like I mentioned before. So we're at about 4 to 5 stories of height at this point. And we're getting closer into EDS, so you're really looking down towards the entire town. So you can see that there's nothing there. This is as the tsunami is leaving. And then we're going more inland. You can see that sort of dust cloud I'm talking about. And then here is looking out towards the hospital and that ballroom after the fact. So this is a good kind of picture as the water is receding. It's also winter time. I should have mentioned that. It's really cold outside. And so people were staying out overnight, of course, without heating. Up to the right, you can see the junior high school. So that was safe. And then the high school is on the opposite hill. They were both safe evacuation locations. But I just give this because it's really hard for me to explain to people the amount of devastation, especially because when I was there in 2014, there was still a lot of debris cleanup going on. So it still somewhat looked like this. And I'll talk a little bit about like my personal connection to the community, but this is one of the apartment buildings. And you can kind of see everybody on top of the apartment building here. Yeah. So I'll stop there, but this gives you an idea of what I mean. Like you can see pictures and images and things like that. I would show a video, but I can't handle video. So I will switch back to the rest of the presentation. If you have questions about like evacuation orders or how people were like managing this, feel free to ask. Okay. So there's a little context for sort of the magnitude of problems that the community was dealing with. And I will then also show you pictures of what it looks like now, because it is not all doom and gloom and terrible. So they've been rebuilding for over 10 years now, and I was fortunate to be part of that process. So EDS is inland, so of course it kind of stayed fine, but many people lost family members, housing, and other things like that. It's primarily a farming area. You can kind of see it's like the idyllic version of Japan, the countryside, very Shizugawa looks mostly like this. They have a couple of businesses located in the lowlands. That's sort of the rule that they cannot build new housing there. And if you did already have a house that was still standing somewhat, you had to get a permit to rebuild it, and the national government would not allow that. So many people subsequently, even if their house survived, had to move elsewhere. There's Togura. You're looking down towards the bay. There used to be an elementary school there, and they have moved it inland. No one perished at the elementary school because the principal, I guess it was like a fluke thing, the evacuation order said to evacuate to the top of the building. He's like, I think we should not do that. And they went up to a local shrine instead, all of the children. And so there were no fatalities at this location, which was great. But they're not going to rebuild anything. They're just going to be a seawall there. And then Utatsu to the north, you can see there's a lot more going on there. There's a high school there. There's a market there. And there's a couple of buildings. And what you can't see is that it quickly gains height. So we're looking at different topography here. But this is kind of what like the community looks like now. Most of the residential areas are much more inland. And so this gives you an idea of their economic recovery. So the problems we were dealing with, I call these wicked problems because if you try to solve one, you run into another, and it's really hard to try and manage them individually. So we have things like unemployment, inequality issues, aging, depopulation, and industrial decline. I'll kind of talk about these briefly. So like a rural community, they do have issues with labor shortages, boom and bust cycles, things like that. And there's often skill gaps. So because there's depopulation, young people leave the community, and so you lose that skilled labor force that you could have locally. There's inequality both in terms of reconstruction processes and who's included in those processes, but also things like power, social status. There's a lot of gender discrimination, things like that. As a rural community, most of the people there are over the age of 65. So that's very common. And because of how Reconstruction happened, the micromobility of people in this community got worse. Instead of rebuilding the train line like every other community after this disaster, they decided to not do that. So everyone became dependent on cars. So that was a real shift for elders. I already mentioned about population decline, and then we have industrial decline, which is kind of a tricky thing. So you have loss of businesses from the disaster, and you have loss of successors through people perishing in the tsunami, but you also have people leaving. So everything becomes very unstable in the economy. And worse is that the economy becomes very undiversified. So while they primarily have farming, fishing, and forestry, they also had a lot of tourism money injected into the community by the national government, because much like what's happening here in the United States, the national government there sort of sees tourism as the panacea for rural communities facing decline. And so there was a lot of stuff put into hospitality and tourism, and not much into other sectors of the economy. Then we have some environmental issues. So I mentioned the radiation, but we also have a lot of soil destruction and topsoil loss. Salt water is extremely caustic. It can also stop a nuclear reactor from melting down. That's how caustic it is. So What happened here is they were doing mostly rice farming, and that's very, clay-based soil. You have all this saltwater intrusion that goes into that area, into the cedar forest, and essentially kills off most of the local cedar forest, but it also makes rice farming extremely difficult. So how are we going to rice farm? Because rice does not like high salinity. It doesn't really appreciate that. So we did a couple of things to sort of deal with a nature caused problem with a nature-based solution, which I'll talk about in a little bit. But we do see a lot of soil destruction because one of the responses from the government was, we'll just take all the topsoil off and then replace it with new soil. That's extremely energy intensive, but also really destructive to the local ecosystem. We also see loss of fish populations and also aquatic habitats. This includes salmon runs specifically in this community. And those have not returned post-disaster despite promises that they would return. And that's primarily because, for those of you who maybe work with salmon runs, salmon are pretty finicky about what you do to where they live. And so they cemented most of the river, which ruined sort of the water quality there, ruined the habitat. So in my professional opinion, the salmon won't ever return unless there's some remediation efforts done. But we'll talk about this a little more when we get to solutions. So why did we pick CBPR? I've given you a bunch of context here. The reason for that was a critical thing happened in 2017. So I'm working in this community in 2014, 2015, 2016. And as you might expect, there's not a whole lot for disaster volunteers to be doing 5 or 6 years after disasters happen. Most of the time you're doing like supply runs, cleanup. You might be helping with physical or manual labor because there's not enough people there to do that. But around this period is when reconstruction starts ramping up. So people were more focused on those acute problems like food, shelter, family, those types of things. And as we move forward, people have some time to like think about, oh, wait, what's happening in town? Like, why are they building this here? Why is this road here, et cetera, et cetera. And so I've been doing interviews for the nonprofit at this time, not for research purposes, just for like helping the nonprofit meet its goals and needs and do assessments. And we were starting to hear things like this. The first one is from a farmer in India, and it's a really good quote. It's also very Japanese, which is, it's as if they're standing on their shoulders, meaning they're looking down on us. So there was a lot of bias in where funding went, and people said, you are favoring certain parts of the community. And then the government would say, well, we'll prove it. And I was like, okay, fine, I will prove it. But so there was this sense that there was unfairness happening, but also people understood that everyone in the community had lost something. So you couldn't really like go down to the central district and be like, hey, maybe you shouldn't be getting all this funding. Could we maybe focus on reconstruction efforts elsewhere? And that's because reconstruction started in Shizugawa first, then it took many years for reconstruction to actually start in the other districts. So unfortunately, that created that sense of bias. Similarly, when the government would come and ask, like, what would you like to happen in the community? We want to do participatory governance. That was very much a one-way communication. It was like informing and consulting. So there wasn't really any dialogue happening or participation happening. So people felt like they weren't being listened to. And also there were votes about safety measures during reconstruction. So should we build a seawall? Should we raise the height of the town? Or should we relocate people? And overwhelmingly, people voted for relocation. They wanted the town to just be left as it was, and everyone was fine with moving elsewhere. However, the national government decided, this wasn't even by the town office, that the seawall would be built, a 10-meter seawall. And for a town that lives with and by the sea, which is like their motto, you would suddenly cut them off from that. And they also decided to artificially raise the town 10 meters. That's a lot of dirt. So what you're seeing here is that river I was mentioning before, and this is 10 meters of cement along the sides of the river. Hence why the salmon probably are not happy. So you can sort of see it come out to the port here, but they also needed that seawall now because you have 10 meters of dirt right on the coastline, and you need something to hold that up. So the town is unrecognizable. If I wasn't going there every year, I would get lost. Because it doesn't look anything like it did before. And that's why this person mentions that it's unrecognizable in many ways. So when I was working with my director of OGA for Aid, which was the primary nonprofit I was working with, we kind of had this crisis where she's like, well, maybe we should just close the nonprofit. Don't really need to do disaster relief anymore. And at this time, I had gone from undergrad into grad school, which was also not planned. And I said, well, I'm learning about community engaged research. Maybe we could do something else with the nonprofit. And I said, why don't we do like some community development efforts? Because there's obviously a lot of social, economic, and environmental problems that people feel like are not being treated relatively quickly. And she said, you know what, maybe we could do that. So between 2016 and 2017, the organization changed from OGA for Aid to Place to Grow, inspiring the next generation of Tohoku. So sort of looking at, community development. So we essentially transitioned in 2017. And at that point, the director really wanted me to lean more into doing research for them and becoming more of that expert rather than a board member or a volunteer. At this point, I was also like doing a lot of farming. If you want to grow green onions in Japan, I'm your person because I'm a professional green onion farmer there. But so we had this transition, which was really important because suddenly I was no longer just doing like community work. It became much more high stakes in terms of getting funding, representing community voices and things like that. And they would intentionally use me for, how do I want to say this? If they wanted to present information to the Reconstruction Agency, which is like a national agency, or if they wanted to present information to the local government, that was maybe negative or was just like an uncomfortable topic, they would have me go and do that because I had some benefits of being a foreigner, being viewed as an expert. And so there was like respectability politics at play. And also if they got mad at me, they didn't lose any social reputation. So I got very comfortable with being in that kind of space. So what is CBPR? You could take like 2 years on this. I'm going to give you it in like 7 minutes. So if you have questions, please ask. Essentially, CBPR is a research design. It's not a research method. Often it's like confused with that. So in CBPR, you have made an intentional decision about how you're going to design your research and that research is going to be designed in partnership with a community partner. It can be 1, it can be 3, or it can be 14. I don't recommend 14. So the main goal is to democratize the research process. So that means the research questions you're asking, your interview or survey protocol, all those types of things are informed by the community. Typically in traditional research, you have total control of how that looks like. In this case, you don't. So it's more about equal sharing of power, making that more equitable. So it's more about democratizing the research process. We also see a lot of co-creation of knowledge in CBPR research designs. And as a result of that, it can be a much longer process but I think there's lots of benefits to that. You create what is valid knowledge within academia, but you also create valid knowledge within the community. And that's really important because, as I said before, there was a lot of efforts to minimize the ways of knowing of people in the community. What CBPR is not. As I mentioned before, it's not a method. So this is not like an interview or a survey or something like that. It's how you're designing your research, who's included in that. Is it going to be iterative? Is it going to be mixed methods? Things like that. It's not when you're working with state agencies, it's not when you're working with other universities, and it's not when you're working with local government. So all of those groups are separated from the community, and they typically have more power or more status. So it's not as grassroots based. The other thing that CBPR is not is it's not research in a community. So if I go to some location and study something there, that's not CBPR. If I'm doing a report about a community or on issues in that community, that's also not CBPR because it's more institutional knowledge. It's also not research for a community, which can be confusing to people. So when I mean for a community, that could be like Angela, who's the director of my nonprofit, being like, hey, I want to have infographics and a deck on what are the increasing obesity rates in Tohoku following this disaster. And please conduct that research for me. Go do that, provide that to her. That is providing research for a community on a particular topic, but it's not necessarily in partnership with the community. So that's a good clarification there. And I like using this quote because more and more commonly now, we see people trying to use CBPR with NSF grants or USDA grants or other things because there's a call for people to include the community. Unfortunately, what happens then is researchers are pushed to include community engagement, let's say, additives without having the training to do that. So what can happen is you have poor community engagement happening. And I like this quote by Wallerstein that talks about this. CBPR is not a community outreach strategy for one-way transmission of information, nor a way for universities to claim they conduct community-based research without commitment to changing internal structures. So this is recognizing the fact that universities may have perpetuated harm in those communities that they now want to do community engaged work with. Okay. So that's your crash course in CPPR. You can ask questions later, but I want to talk about the partnerships for a bit. So as I said before, between 2014 and 2017, I'm working with OGA for Aid. That then transfers into Place to Grow. So they're essentially the same organization. And I'm working with Green Farmers Miyagi, which is one of the examples I'll give. It was a farming initiative that we created that then turned into its own business. It's like the top 3 farming businesses in Miyagi Prefecture today. So it's a good success. The reason why we got here is because at the time I said, there's ways for us to design research in a way that will be accepted by the experts, but also meet community needs. And these are some of the books I was using at the time for those of you who are interested in this. And it also met some of the values that we had as a nonprofit working with community members. This is kind of a rehashing of many of the principles you saw on the CBPR slide, which is we wanted to have equitable inclusion of people in solution-making processes. We wanted to make sure that there was value and legitimacy around people's individual knowledge. We also wanted to have joint learning, skill sharing, and capacity building among partners. And what I mean by that is if we were doing something and suddenly we did not have the capabilities to do that, we would tap one of our other partners to kind of bring in and do that. And through doing that, we would have joint learning amongst the community partners. We often had like training workshops and other things while this was going on. We were committed to a long-term process. We were there for over a decade, and we really wanted to engage locally identified problems and respond to those with locally identified solutions. So having interventions that would have a lot of buy-in by community members. This helped us address a couple of things. People are really tired for reasonable reasons. But there's a lot of disinterest because there had been a lot of research malpractice where people come in and come out, and people are kind of emotionally exhausted from that. But people are also exhausted from volunteers coming in, making friendships with them, and then the volunteers leave. So there's a lot of reasons why people would not be interested in participating in this. And we were also addressing harmful norms. So we were trying to empower residents to be like, come to our forum and please share your thoughts. And you will meet other people who want to do that same thing. So trying to make them feel like I can participate in decision-making processes and people want me to be there. So I had those 3 original partners, and then we rapidly expanded as we realized that we were kind of biting off more than we could chew. And so we had sort of a community task force that appeared, which some of the people from these organizations were there. And I just want to mention them briefly. So we have Mr. Yamauchi from Minami Sanriku Junior Academy. He was the previous principal of the Shizugawa High School, and he was sort of our contact for the Board of Education and working with schools in the area. Mr. Oikawa, which was the head of the Tourism Association, and this was really important because he would fight for us to get funding because a lot of the redevelopment funds went into tourism associations and not the local government. So there was sort of that issue we were trying to get around. Mayu is a good friend of mine. She works with like a sustainability organization. And then Mr. Abe works with EDS, which is a training center and inn. So we would get like universities coming through there who wanted to do some like service learning and things like that. So it's like free labor. However I could get free labor, we were going to do it. In Toguro, we were working with a lot of fishers. So we have the Toguro Fishers Association. And then with the association, we also had the Toguro Sea Boys. They are hilarious. I wish I could show you more pictures of them. But they helped us work with elder farmers especially, because in Toguro, I can't talk about it a lot, but they are probably the golden child for how you can have sustainable fishing and sustainable forestry in one place. I think it's the only place in the world that has both of those certifications. I could be wrong. But they were able to get 90 fishers to agree on how to all fish together and created a cooperative. So they're really great for working with that. And then I have a bunch of other affiliates. These are mostly like women's groups. So Women's Eye, Mama Circle. Women's Eye has gone to the UN to talk about these issues. Nokobo is a farming cooperative. And then we had other groups that were participating. So within these 8 to 10 years, we're working with like 12 to 14 different organizations or groups. And because that was scaffolded, we didn't do this like right out the gate. We were able to sort of build on these over time. So some examples of how we utilize these resources, power, and also people. So I mentioned local farming. So we have seawater come into rice fields. Rice doesn't like to grow in high salinity. And we had an issue where we had no identification of who owned land because everything was kept paper copies. And if 84% of the town is gone, you have no paper copies of anything. We had farmers unfortunately pass away. Then we had issues with, people are aging out. They physically cannot farm anymore. So we have all these things happening at the same time. What happens is there is predatory companies who want to come in and buy up this land, like corporatized farming. And so it was a real threat because rice farming is the primary agricultural activity in this community. And it's still mostly done by hand. So sort of a traditional practice. And farmers were like, we don't want to give up our land, but we also can't use the land. And you cannot just leave land fallow. There's lots of rules in Japan about vacant property. And so we said, well, we can grow green onion in that soil, and green onion will happily live there. So you can see green onion here on the right. They're actually quite tall. It's not like scallions like we have in the United States. You could like beat someone over the head with green onion. But green onion is really good because it can tolerate high salinity. It can also pull out some of that salt through other processes too, like evaporation of the salt naturally over time. And so we had about 56 plots of land with this growing in it. This is very mountainous. So you're doing everything by hand, tilling by hand, transplanting by hand, processing by hand, harvesting by hand. And these are like football fields large, like they're massive. But the other benefit of doing that is we were able to keep those plots of land owned by the farmer. They would essentially just like lease the land to us. We would do all this work with it, maintain the land. And over time, I think it was like around that 5 or 8 year benchmark, we were able to return many of these plots to rice farming. So there was returning that land back to local farm owners. So using nature to deal with high salt levels. The other benefit of using green onions is Japan obviously suffers from typhoons, and green onions are like cockroaches. Nothing can kill them. So a typhoon comes and it will completely flatten the field. And then within 3 months, they'll just grow upright again. And so you can still sell the green onion versus other products that would be damaged or otherwise ruined in that process. So if you ever need to deal with salty conditions or hurricanes or typhoons, green onions are great. We also did a couple other things like children's workshops and community events. So there was a lack of educational attainment in this community. And so we focused on using children's workshops to provide spaces for that. And this created more civil engagement as well. So this was good for decreasing social isolation, improving socialization, and also got community members to sort of come together. So remember, they're all in different temporary shelters. So also provided a space for that. And community events sort of do the same thing. However, community events were more focused on bringing in outside groups into the community and using their labor and time to sort of do projects that the community could not fund themselves. So it was a little bit manipulative, but it worked. So these are just some examples of how we use CBPR, because we would do research, get an idea of what the problem was, craft an intervention, execute that intervention, and then move on from there. So it was a very cyclical process. And I promise I have 4 more minutes and I'm almost done. So here's a snapshot of what this looks like. I'm going to orient you to this slide because there is a lot going on. So at the bottom here, we have a timeline. And then below that, we have my primary partners. So these are people I'm working with like every day when I'm there. And then across this, you have what our focus was as an organization and as a community task force. So you'll see that disaster relief focus, temporary housing assistance, supply distribution, etc. And then 2016, 2017, you see that shift where we start focusing on local issues related to forestry, farming, and fishing. And we address those things through different things like using interviews or surveys or content analysis of policy documents. Lots of different methods were used. I just put the primary method up here for sake of space. And then we have overlap where we start doing like resource analysis, community assessments, need assessments, and doing partnerships with the town office and submitting reports every year and asking for money for particular projects in the community. And then in the final bit, we have more of a focus on community disunity. So at this time, that feeling of bias and favoritism has really created a lot of schisms in the community. And then we have some of the solutions I talked about before. So a lot of this is fundraising campaigns. Over time, we had about $2 million of impact in this community, which was quite good. We had those reports to the town office. We created a new labor program for how farmers could hire outside sources of labor. We did reports to local partners on issues, like a newsletter kind of. And then we also, of course, had like academic publications come out of this. And those things helped legitimate what we were doing to the town office, but also to the Reconstruction Agency and also to the prefectural government. So we were trying to do multiple things over time. And you can ask questions about this because I obviously don't have time to talk about all of it. But I do want to talk about the latter part. So over this period of time, I lost count, like 250-ish interviews or something like that. Most of them were for the benefit of the nonprofit. So these were not for research. These were just for assessment-based things. But in 2019, 2021, we were really trying to deal with the social isolation in the community and the separation of districts and this feeling of unfairness. And so we did a sort of community mapping survey, is what I call it, and I'll show you a picture of it, where we wanted to see who did people know. So for those of you familiar with social network analysis, you're like, this is SNA, but it's not actually SNA because we're doing physical mapping of relationships. So people would put down 10 people that they know, and then they would also put what kind of power those people held in the community. We were able to quickly see like how much insider-outsider relationships there were, who they trusted in the community, and if they had connections to decision makers. We also did the same thing with organizational mapping to see what was the trust like for organizations in the community. And we, of course, had that task force. And that task force was essentially a 5-member group. Every single time we did analysis, every single time we were trying to interpret something, we all had to come to consensus on what it was. So again, very time consuming, but very rewarding. So we did surveys. You can see some of these maps here. We would test it, and then we would get feedback from the community, and then we would recreate the survey and improve it, and then implement it. So we had about 200 surveys go out, 2,000 social ties were recorded, which is about 10% of the total community roughly. And then 800 organizational ties were recorded. And this is because people were listing multiple ones on their maps. This is what that looked like. So this is the social network map. And essentially what had happened is we wanted to figure out, are people actually as insulated as they say they are? And they are. And so what we had them do is in the middle is like high or deep trust or reputation or reliability. And people would place them there, and then they would put these shapes around them to indicate, are they powerful in the neighborhood? Are they powerful in the district? Or are they powerful at the town level? And so we were able to see very quickly if people in the community had these connections. You can see here, this person relatively has a lot of connections. But we also did this with organizations in the community and found that many of them held some form of power, and many people were integrated with community organizations, which was good to see. I can talk about this a little bit more in the Q&A. But essentially, we presented this information to the town office and to Fulbright, because we got a Fulbright grant for this project as well, which was great. And from that, they were going to do different community events or different types of events in the other districts to sort of remediate a lot of this isolating effect that they had done between like 2016 and 2019. And then quickly, just some outcomes, and then we'll be done here. So we did a lot in this community, about 1 million in disaster relief, and then about 1 million in different community and economic projects. When we were doing that farming initiative, also all of the produce that was created from that was given to local families, and we had something like 4,300 beneficiaries from that. These are some of the more descriptive campaigns we did. So cultural exchange program, the Farmer Association I mentioned before, 3,500 beneficiaries, I was off. And then we did a local tour program, which was like sort of a storytelling program for people to memorialize the disaster. So we are no longer working there. The nonprofit closed in 2022 to give way to a locally owned nonprofit because all of us were either Japanese nationals or foreigners working for free in this nonprofit, and we wanted them to take more ownership of all this programming. So between 2020 and 2022, we transitioned ownership to locals. And we also were trying to be a conduit for people. Oftentimes when organizations would leave, when nonprofits leave, you leave a hole there. That can be physical space because you've lost friends, but it can also be institutional ties. You are sort of a hub for networking. So it was really important to us that when we left the community that they were able to continue doing this work on their own. And that gets us to our little discussion prompt question, which is replacing keystones. So many of you do research projects. You've been doing them for ages, maybe, and maybe you're the lead of that project, or maybe you're someone serving a niche role that's really critical to that project. Even if you're not doing community work, this can apply to anything. And so when you lose that person, it's like losing a keystone. And so the whole thing will collapse. So when you're doing nonprofit work or CBPR work, that can kind of happen once you leave that space. So what I kind of want us to think about a little bit beyond the questions you might have for me is, how do you view yourself as a keystone in the work that you do? And if you were to leave that project or leave your community work, how would you make sure that there's a new keystone there to make sure that things can keep going, that people have the resources that they need? And that can be either as a researcher, from a view as a researcher, or the view as an organization. Thank you.
Fantastic, Keely. Thank you.
Get out of here. There we go.
Questions? Thoughts about the question Keely posed about a keystone?
Trying to formulate my thoughts.
Those are totally fine.
So I've heard like about two similar approaches, but I haven't heard the specific term of community.
Community-based participatory research. It's a mouthful. I know.
But yeah, I mean, there's definitely a lot of, I don't want to say conflict, but there could be a lot of, you are inviting a lot more, back and forth in this approach, obviously.
Yeah.
It sounds like you definitely think it's worth it in that, but you talk a little bit more about like the benefits versus the cost of like really bringing in the community in this way.
Yeah. Especially if we're looking at like time to completion and things like that. So I would say if you're using CBPR, it's not something that like you accidentally start doing. So typically if you're using CBPR, you have some reasons for doing that. And in this case, it's usually a community that's been harmed in some way, or it's a hidden population, so they're just really hard to reach for many reasons. But when you bring on community partners, you have to go through a lot of front-loaded work. So you're spending like a year or two doing all of these things about like, what is the project actually going to look like? What do you want us to do? What is the scope of the research questions? And getting consensus at that stage. So for sometimes it can be faster. It can be like 3 to 6 months, but it can be longer, especially if you don't already have ties to that community. So that's what I mean by you can't just like sort of parachute in somewhere and be like, I want to do this project. It's just not going to happen. So you have to have some previous connection. So even before you start doing CBPR design, you have to do all of that beforehand. So maybe I should make it 3 or 4 years prep work, front-loaded work. So that's the real cost to this, is the timing. So a lot of times when you see grants for these types of things, it's like 2 years of funding. And we just kind of laugh at that because it's just not feasible. So you have to sort of plan out, like, what are you going to do? I had the benefit of, I started doing this in undergrad. So I had done like that 4 to 5 years of like community building before we even got to this stage. So I had that benefit. The other thing that can happen is people leave, people come and go. There can be disagreements while you're doing the research, and how you manage that will essentially be whether or not the project continues or not. So you could spend like 4 or 5 years on a project and then it just evaporates. That can also happen. So there's a lot of time and investment, and you might not see any outcome from that, whether that's a publication, a community intervention, or what have you. The benefit is you do really create that community capacity building, and you do see more participation by the public in these types of processes. And so if your goal is not just research, but also you want to sort of mend some of the social, economic, political, environmental problems, this can be a way to do that in a way that is sustainable, meaning you don't just do the intervention and leave. People will actually continue doing that thing, if that answers your question.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah, this is, I think, a related thing, but not exactly the same. The one thing that there's other group that does quite a bit of is the design for development, I think is what people used to call it. And so there's been a big conflict in that field about, do you design something that can be manufactured locally? Or do you design something that can be manufactured cheaper and better elsewhere and distribute it to a lot more people?
Yeah.
And so I'm curious. What are my thoughts on that?
So it's like, is it made by people in the community at higher cost, or is the cost exported elsewhere and then sold back to the community? Am I understanding that correctly?
Yeah.
I think I hate that it depends. But it does, it depends, because no community is the same. It really depends on how many resources that community has and if they are open to that sort of process. So what could happen is if you do the second option, like exporting it, doing all that work and then bringing it back in, is you do invite external sort of actors into the community that may not have been intended, possibly. Versus if you're doing it in the community, it might be more costly, but you may see more long-term benefits, like let's say 10, 20 years out compared to having a different group do all those things, if that makes sense. But it's really a comparison of trade-offs, both economically and socially, that you would have to consider as a group. And I think it would depend on like who the community is. If they have a longer history of predatory research or a longer history of like disenfranchisement by different local actors, then it might be better to keep it within the community than to export it elsewhere. Yes.
Defining the community. So you
Mhm.
said the government is not part of the community,
No.
but they are presumably participatory, like the community is presumably voting for local governments, right?
Mhm.
So how are you picking a community that's not represented by the government without just picking some like, political movement or something?
Oh, you mean like by not working with the local government as
Or
an
just
actor?
like how is the government a biased external force and you're not a biased?
Oh, okay, I see what you mean. So when we were working as an organization, we had a rule that we would do work everywhere in the community and we would not be centrally located anywhere. But one of the reasons why we were not direct partners with the local government is because the local government in many ways was disenfranchised by prefectural government and the national government. So it's very paternalistic, like top-down kind of structure. And so the local government would say, we want to do participatory governance. We want to invite you to these, they call them townspeople conferences, where we're going to talk about a variety of these safety measures and we want your input on them. And they had promised people that it would actually be a dialogue, which means town people present their ideas. They had a panel of experts there to evaluate those ideas in real time. And then the conference would end, and then the participatory part never came to fruition, which was actually dealing with decision-making around which solution we're going to choose and why, or if we're going to change that solution in some way and why, and also having consensus on that. So this happened, like those types of things happened in 2011, 2012, and 2013. When people also don't really have the capacity to be engaging in those for obvious reasons, like they don't have shelter, water, all sorts of things. And so essentially the local government unfortunately like overpromised what they were going to be able to do. And then the prefectural national government was like, we're only going to give you funding if you do this specific thing, which was build a seawall. So even if the local government was like, well, we don't want to build a seawall, they're like, well, you don't get a choice. So the reason why we didn't include the town office as an actor or part of the task force was because there was just a lot of hurt between locals and the town office, which is also why, weirdly enough, we work with the tourism association. So there was still some government actor, just wasn't like the mayor. And it's also because the mayor participated in governance issues. So 10 years before this disaster happened, the town was supposed to move many of the public offices out of the lowlands into higher areas. And this town went through a consolidation. So all these districts used to be autonomous like villages and towns, and then they became one town. So lots of issues there. I couldn't get into that because there's a lot of like, political issues. And so there was this sense that Shizugawa, as a larger town that then became incorporated with everything else, and the mayor being from Shizugawa, there was a view of like, you're intrinsically biased towards your previous town, now district. And there was proof of that. So he decided to not move offices. And then 10 years later, we have the tsunami and hundreds of people lose their lives in those buildings. And so there was also a view from locals that he was just a bad representative of the community. So in order to make sure that our organization could actually reach the most people possible, we just didn't associate with the mayor and the board, because we could accomplish more by not being attached to them. And I could still send reports to them and talk to them and do whatever, but they were intentionally kind of what is quarantined from what we were doing. And that meant that when we were working with people and we said, like, we're listening to you and we want to like make sure that we can try and represent what you're having issues with, they believed us because we didn't have this attachment. So on like the public facing side, it looked like we were completely separated from that. But internally, when we were working on problems and things like that, we would engage with government actors. It just wasn't as overt. And primarily because we're trying to focus on community issues versus national government things, like how do we rebuild the economy nationally? So different scales were also at play. If that answers your question. Yeah. Or
I have another question. So, kind of from the other angle, I feel like a lot of times, especially at EASL, we kind of end up in this situation where we're like trying to describe CDPR, but like then people kind of end up in this space where they're like, well, I have trouble articulating what we are bringing
oh
to the table.
yeah. I have a picture of
And
that.
so I'm curious, I mean, I have my opinions, but I'm curious what you think that scientists are bringing to the table in a situation like this.
Okay, am I able? How do I get the screen back on?
Yeah.
Did I step on something? Hello? It's me. Maybe. Darn. I promise I didn't do anything. I did not break like $3,000 screens. What I think will be helpful for me to show you is our physical copy of our research design. I can send it to you if this decides not to work. So you have to be really into organization if you're using CBPR. And so one of the things we did is we charted out what we were contributing and then what the community was contributing and then how that sort of melded into a joint project. So oftentimes as a researcher or as an expert, your benefit is you have access to forms of knowledge, forms of legitimacy, other areas of expertise. Like you can have access to software that community partners can't afford to buy. I already mentioned funding, I think. But other things are that many times they can lean on you for expertise that then you can train them on. So there can be this back and forth between the researcher and the community. Darn, it's not working. I wonder if I present, if it will. Oh,
Wow.
oh, okay. All right, great. So I did not show this because obviously this is way too convoluted to have during a talk. But we essentially created this like, if you say yes, pass go. If you say no, return to where you started. So you start up here, like whatever issue you're dealing with calls for obtaining evidence from multiple quantitative and qualitative sources, which you as a researcher can do. You say yes, you move on. You work with the community about identifying priorities and developing research questions. Do we agree upon these? Yes. Move on. So you select your methods. And then for here, we had a reason why we chose these methods. So you have a rationale, which is something that researchers can provide, especially if the community is trying to get funding from like a local government. It could be like, for example, from the city of Boulder. And you can provide credibility criteria for this. But more importantly, on the left is like during data collection, you can provide the necessary structure for doing that data collection. And oftentimes they say like, we really want to do this survey. And I said, that's great, but it's actually really not feasible to do a survey that way because it's not how surveys work. And you do that in a way that's not like condescending or anything like that. Or how they want to do interviews, be like, okay, this is how we can actually do that interview and what it would look like in practice. Comparison to how they might do it. And they might get worse data from that or unusable data from that. So you're kind of stopping these sort of research problems from appearing. What we did is we had these data collection methods. And then while these were going on, we were simultaneously doing community projects because often as a researcher, you need to show that you are committed, not just to your research interests, but to what is going on in the community. So we had a variety of these workshops, leadership workshops, community forums, and these were all things that would lead into community development. So we'd be doing the research, participating in community development, and this is like mixed methods essentially. And while we were getting information from the data, we could tweak what we were doing in the community projects. So there was this intentional back and forth between the research and whatever community intervention was going on. And without having sort of that real-time data, it wouldn't be possible to improve the projects as they were going. That's like one way in which researchers can sort of participate in community, and like how you sort of sell yourself to community. Oftentimes it's how I was used. They're like, we need funding for this. And I said, I will apply for it. Or how do we navigate a grant application? Well, typically most of us have written a grant application. We can provide that type of service. And kind of demystify those types of processes, because we're bringing institutional knowledge and they're bringing community knowledge, and those two things don't have to be diametrically opposed to each other. If that answers your question. It's not me.
Time, so, if you have more questions.
I can chat with you.
Yeah. All right, thanks, Keely.